The alley was quiet, too quiet, as if the city itself had paused to watch. A lone streetlight flickered, casting long shadows that twisted across the cracked pavement. The girl's breath came in shallow bursts, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the thin strap of her bag. Fear sat behind her ribs, heavy and unrelenting. Every instinct told her to run, to vanish into the night, but there was nowhere to go. And then he appeared, not with a shout, not with a threat, but with a presence that made the shadows bend around him. Tall, impossibly composed, every step deliberate. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the alley with precision, yet somehow landed on her and lingered. She could not look away. "Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue." She realized almost immediately that he was not here to scare her with words or violence. He didn't need to. Everything about him, his measured stance, the faint crease between his brows, the quiet authority in the way he breathed, demanded attention. The kind of attention that left her chest tight and her pulse erratic. 26, her life had seemed ordinary, predictable even. But now, in this moment, she understood the truth. The choices her family had made had brought her here. They had sold her out. She was the repayment, the collateral, and he was the man they had chosen to settle their debts with. He spoke first, his voice calm and measured. "You don't need to be afraid." The calm in his tone was almost worse than fear. She had prepared for anger, malice, or harsh commands, but not this. The certainty, the quiet control, it unsettled her. He didn't need to force obedience, it was already there. The world behind the alley seemed to fade. She noticed the way his coat fell perfectly over his shoulders, how his gaze didn't wander but stayed fixed, unblinking, measuring. She realized that he could command more than attention. He could demand the truth of anyone before him with a single look. For a moment she studied him in return. There was age in the set of his jaw, a quiet experience in the lines of his face, but it did nothing to lessen his presence. He was older, much older, but his age had brought refinement, not fragility. This was Pete Rowland, though she didn't know it yet, and in turn he would learn hers, Janelle Spark. Her thoughts raced as the reality of her situation hit fully. Her family had gambled with her life to settle debts they could not pay. The realization was raw and immediate. This wasn't a story she could negotiate. This wasn't a warning she could avoid. She had been traded. And yet standing here facing him, she felt the flicker of something else, something she hadn't expected. He wasn't cruel. He didn't threaten. He simply stood, watching, and in that watching was a challenge she could not ignore. She had expected fear to consume her, but curiosity began to thread its way through the panic. The alley had become a cage, but not one of bars. It was defined by her choices, or lack thereof, and the man who controlled the space. He was older, deliberate, precise, every movement measured. Yet she couldn't shake the awareness that, despite the fear, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that she was not simply a thing to be traded. Minutes passed. The streetlight flickered again, and she noticed the calm confidence in him as he finally spoke her name. Janelle Spark. He did not smile, did not offer kindness, but there was recognition in his voice, as if her existence had already been catalogued and assessed. She swallowed, forcing herself to breathe through the tension. 26 and already marked by circumstance. The weight of her family's mistakes pressed against her, but something in his presence, something quiet, unyielding, and precise, made her realize that the world had shifted entirely. The man in front of her would not define her suffering. He might, in ways she could not yet see, redefine her survival. For the first time that night, she allowed herself a thought she could barely admit. She would have to endure this. She would have to navigate it, carefully, cautiously, and perhaps, if she was clever enough, on her own terms. He didn't offer comfort or threat. He simply watched. And in that silence, in the weight of his observation, she understood the first lesson of her new reality. This man, older and untouchable in his confidence, was a force she could neither ignore nor resist. The alley seemed longer, narrower, as if it were leading somewhere unavoidable. She could hear faint footsteps approaching, a distant reminder that this arrangement was not yet finalized, that the world outside was still hungry for payment, for control. But here, in the space between shadows and streetlight, she and he existed alone. Two people bound by circumstance, by fear, by a debt she had not chosen but could not escape. The beginning of everything was quiet, deliberate, and entirely irreversible. The quiet of the alley had broken only when a car door shut several blocks away. She had hoped that once she stepped into this new world, the fear might ease, that clarity would come with movement, but it didn't. The fear remained, coiling tighter around her chest, and yet curiosity stirred within the edges of her panic. He led her without a word through streets she didn't recognize, their destination unknown. Her eyes darted to every shadow, every figure on the sidewalks, expecting danger to erupt at any moment. She noticed the contrast immediately. He walked with precision, each footfall deliberate, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Every detail about him screamed control, the tilt of his shoulders, the rhythm of his steps, the calm in his gaze that didn't falter, even when a drunk staggered into the street near them. When he finally spoke, it was soft, measured, devoid of condescension, but with authority that required listening. "You need to understand the rules here," he said. The words were not a command but a statement, as though stating them aloud made them immutable. She didn't respond. Words failed her. Fear and confusion still clung to her like a second skin. He turned slightly, just enough that she noticed the subtle lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray threads in his hair that framed an otherwise strikingly youthful face. He was older, definitely in his 50s, but his age carried the weight of experience, not weakness. Every feature suggested someone who had built a life carefully, measured every risk, and had emerged untouchable. This was Pete Rowland, though she had only known the name moments before. His reputation preceded him, in whispered mentions, in headlines she had skimmed online, though she had never imagined meeting him like this. The streets opened into a small, understated building, not a mansion, no sweeping luxury, nothing to announce wealth. And that in itself unsettled her more. The contrast between his presence and the modest exterior made her wonder, if this man could command power without spectacle, what else could he control? Inside, the air was cool, scented faintly with polished wood and something faintly metallic, like cold steel. He gestured toward a seat by a narrow table, and she obeyed, acutely aware of the quiet authority in his movements. He did not hover. He did not demand. He simply moved with the certainty of someone who understood the rules of influence in a way that needed no explanation. "You're safe here," he said finally. The words were quiet but firm, carrying an unshakable certainty that made her feel simultaneously relieved and more aware of the precariousness of her position. Safe, but not free. She could not forget that she had been delivered into his hands by a family desperate enough to barter her life. He placed a folder on the table, no flourish, no announcement, just the weight of inevitability. She glanced at it cautiously. Papers, contracts, numbers, her life reduced to legal language and signatures she had not yet signed. He did not explain, did not demand acknowledgement. He simply waited. Time passed in silence. She noticed how his eyes lingered on her, not inappropriately, but with calculation, like a chess player studying an unpredictable piece. He was assessing her in ways she couldn't yet articulate, her reactions, her posture, the subtle ways she held herself under stress. Finally she spoke, her voice a whisper, why me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he regarded her with a patience that made her chest ache. Then he said, "Because your family needed a solution, and I needed someone who would be cooperative." Cooperative. The word struck her, carrying the cold precision of a man accustomed to negotiation. But even in that she detected no malice. There was no cruelty in his voice, no relish in the transaction she had feared. Just clarity, a statement of fact. The hours that followed were quiet, almost monotonous, but each moment reinforced what she had begun to realize. This man, this older, impeccably composed figure, was a force she could neither resist nor predict. He was not angry. He did not shout. He did not demand. He simply existed in control, and that control was absolute. By the time night crept in through the small windows, she had begun to see something unexpected in the way he moved through the space. He protected boundaries without needing to declare them. He observed without judgment. He measured without interference. She realized slowly that this was not just a man who had wealth. This was a man who understood influence, attention, and the subtle, immutable rules of power. And yet, in that understanding, a flicker of curiosity emerged. He had accepted her presence, her existence in this controlled space, without making her a possession in the way she had feared. She could not explain why, but it unsettled her more than fear ever had. It was then, after hours of quiet observation and measured words, that she finally registered it fully. Pete Rowland was a man of immense control, older and commanding, yet he had made a choice not to harm her. In the stillness of the room, the weight of that decision settled on her. She had been sold, yes, but she was not being broken. Not yet. And in that strange, unsettling truth, she felt the first cautious flicker of possibility. The room was quiet, except for the soft scratch of a pen against paper. A single lamp cast a halo of light over the table, illuminating the documents that would define the next chapter of her life. Janelle Sparks sat stiffly, hands folded, every muscle tense. Her pulse drummed in her ears as if warning her that this moment was irreversible. The man across from her, Pete Rowland, moved slowly, deliberately. He did not rush, did not glance impatiently at the clock. He adjusted the papers with a careful precision, the faint creases of his sleeves showing the weight of decades of control and habit. Nothing about him betrayed uncertainty. He was measured, confident, immovable. Janelle had expected threats, intimidation, anger, perhaps even disdain. Instead, she encountered something else, a meticulous, almost clinical calm. That calm was more unsettling than anything she could have imagined. It reminded her that the transaction about to occur wasn't just legal, it was absolute. Her parents' faces flashed in her mind, pale and desperate, unwilling to meet her gaze when they handed over the responsibility of repayment. They had calculated this carefully, or at least they thought they had. She had become the solution to their problem, and now she had to confront what that truly meant. Pete slid a document toward her. The edges were crisp, almost sharp, as though the paper itself carried the weight of the decision it represented. She dared not touch it at first, afraid that even a single finger on its surface would confirm the permanence of her reality. "This is the formal agreement," he said, his voice even neutral, without judgment or emotion. "Everything you need to understand is in there. You can review it, or I can explain it to you line by line. Your choice." The offer of choice should have felt comforting. Instead, it was a reminder that her options had been stripped to the barest minimum. She could sign and comply, or she could refuse and face consequences that she could not begin to imagine. And yet, in his calm delivery, she sensed something unexpected. He was not pushing, not coercing. He simply allowed her the dignity of hesitation, though the finality of the transaction remained unchanged. Janelle took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands. She scanned the first page, terms, conditions, stipulations. Words like assignment, custody, and responsibility jumped from the page. Her stomach churned. The language was precise, unyielding. Her life had been reduced to clauses and signatures. He observed her closely, noting her reaction with subtle interest. There was no impatience, no ridicule, only attention. That gaze made her aware of every movement, every thought, and it was simultaneously comforting and frightening. She realized with an uncomfortable clarity that this man did not need to assert dominance through anger or coercion. His presence alone was enough. "I need you to understand one thing," he said after a long pause. "This isn't about ownership. It's about resolving an obligation, Everything you see here, the rules, the expectations, they exist to protect you as much as they exist to protect the terms of the agreement. The words were unexpected. She had envisioned abuse, harsh commands, indignities beyond imagining. Instead, he spoke of protection, of boundaries, of respect within an arrangement she had feared would strip her of all agency. She looked at him, noting the faint gray streaks in his hair, the calm in his eyes, the lines etched by experience. Age had not softened him, it had sharpened him, honed him into someone whose judgment was precise, whose power was unassailable, yet tempered by awareness. Minutes stretched. Each was punctuated by the faint rustle of paper, the subtle creak of the chair beneath her weight, the distant hum of city life outside. She realized that this moment, the signing, the agreement, was not merely a transaction of circumstance. It was the first test of her understanding, her resilience, and her perception of him. Finally, she nodded. Not because she had accepted her situation fully, she had not, but because she recognized the clarity of reality. This was her life now, at least for the foreseeable future. The documents before her were not just ink and paper, they were the lines that would define the boundaries of her survival. Pete placed a pen beside the papers, not pressing, not urging. She hesitated one last time, feeling the weight of the silence. And then, deliberately, she signed. Each signature was a quiet acknowledgement of the arrangement, a measured step into a life she had not chosen but could navigate with care. As she handed the pen back, he studied her calmly, noting the subtle shift in her posture, the tentative acceptance in her eyes. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction in power asserted. There was simply recognition, acknowledgement that she had understood, that she had taken the first step in navigating an uncertain path. When the papers were gathered, he finally spoke, his tone unchanged. "This doesn't define you. It defines the terms, everything else. How you respond, what you do next, that remains yours." The words lingered. She realized as the immediate tension of the transaction eased that the moment was not the end. It was a beginning. A beginning shadowed by fear, yes, but also tinged with a quiet, impossible curiosity. And in that quiet, she glimpsed something she had not expected. The man before her, older, composed, formidable, and measured, was not just the executor of a family's desperation. He was something else entirely, a man whose intentions were unknowable, whose presence was commanding, and whose control could both terrify and perhaps protect. The transaction was complete, but the story, hers, his, and the uneasy intersection of their lives, was only just beginning. The first night passed without incident, but it left Janelle sleepless. The apartment, modest, unassuming, practical, was nothing like she had imagined a billionaire's residence would be. There were no ostentatious displays of wealth, no crystal chandeliers, no walls lined with expensive art. Just quiet order, precision, and the subtle weight of someone who moved through life with absolute control. She lay awake on the narrow bed in the guest room, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the windows, and found herself thinking about the man she had been delivered to. Pete Rowland. Older, composed, commanding, and yet restrained in ways she could not yet define. He was the embodiment of power without spectacle, authority without aggression. It unnerved her more than any scream or raised voice ever could. Morning came, gray and muted, and with it the reality she could not avoid. Breakfast was a quiet, efficient affair. He did not hover or demand conversation, only offered what was necessary: a plate of eggs, toast, coffee, water. His movements were deliberate, precise, yet devoid of arrogance or impatience. He watched her from across the table, not in expectation, but in assessment, as though measuring the shape of her fear and the faint stirrings of resilience. "You should eat," he said simply. No warmth, no lecture, just a statement of fact. She did not respond immediately. Fear still lingered like a shadow at her shoulder, a reminder that she was, in many ways, trapped in someone else's plan. But she nodded, allowing herself to take the plate, and as she did, she noticed something subtle. He did not intrude on her space. He did not reach for her or impose his presence beyond what was necessary. He allowed her movement, her choice within the boundaries of the rules. The reality of her situation began to settle in. She had been sold, not out of malice, not for pleasure, but as a solution to her family's debts. And yet, here was a man who could have treated her however he wished, who could have used his power to intimidate or control in ways far more overt than mere legal documents, and instead he observed, waited, and permitted her dignity. It was disorienting. She had expected cruelty, she had prepared for humiliation. Instead, she encountered restraint and attention, and the combination left her both cautious and curious. The day unfolded in measured movements. He showed her the boundaries of the apartment, the small rules that governed her daily life, what was hers, what was off limits, and what was expected of her in the quiet, precise rhythm of this controlled environment. There were no lectures, no drama, no shouting, just facts, instructions, guidelines she could follow to navigate this new reality. And yet, as hours passed, subtle shifts emerged. A cup of coffee left within reach. A door closed behind him quietly to grant her privacy. A faint acknowledgement when she hesitated before touching a document or stepping into a space she was unsure of. These were small acts, almost imperceptible, but in them lay an unspoken recognition. He did not see her merely as an object or a solution. Fear remained, but it transformed at the edges into something else. Awareness, caution, tentative curiosity. She realized for the first time that the man who had the power to terrify her had chosen not to. He had opted for control without cruelty, observation without interference, presence without possession. By evening, Janelle found herself walking along the narrow balcony. The city lights stretched below her like a scattering of distant stars. He had allowed her this moment alone. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, though the awareness of his observation lingered. Pete joined her then, not stepping too close, not demanding attention. He leaned lightly against the railing, silent at first, his gaze sweeping the city in the same deliberate precision he applied to everything else. "You're adapting," he said finally. Not a question, not praise, just observation. She bristled at the simplicity of the statement. It was as if he could see the small, silent victories she had claimed for herself. Finishing breakfast without hesitation, following instructions without error, surviving the first day without surrendering to panic. "Yes," she said carefully, still avoiding his eyes. I have to." He nodded, that was all, but the nod carried weight, approval without indulgence, recognition without condescension. It was a lesson she did not fully understand yet. Fear could coexist with observation, and survival could coexist with respect. The day ended with her retreating to the guest room, exhausted but alert. The reality had hit her fully. She was now living within the boundaries defined by Pete Rowland, a man who wielded his power with quiet, calculated precision. She feared him, yes, but she also began to notice something she hadn't expected, moments of clarity, of subtle protection, of an acknowledgement that her presence mattered, even if only in his assessment. And as sleep finally claimed her, Janelle understood something unspoken but undeniable. Fear had met reality, and reality was far more complicated than she had imagined. The man who could have destroyed her had chosen restraint. The girl who had been sold had survived her first day. And between them, the tension of power, control, and unspoken recognition had begun to take form, a tension that neither of them fully understood yet, but which would shape everything to come. Days passed in a rhythm that was at once disorienting and strangely precise. Janelle Spark moved through the apartment with caution, her steps measured, her eyes alert to every shadow, every subtle change in the environment. The space itself was neither luxurious nor imposing. It was functional, clean, and organized, an extension of the man who inhabited it. The quiet efficiency of the rooms reflected his control, but it was not oppressive. It allowed movement, allowed thought, allowed the smallest flicker of independence. Pete Rowland observed all of it, not with judgment, not with impatience, but with deliberate attention. Every movement she made, every reaction to instructions or moments of uncertainty was noted, catalogued, and assessed. He did not intervene unless necessary. He did not hover. He did not assert himself, and that more than anything else unsettled her. She realized slowly that he had the power to dominate her in countless ways through wealth, influence, or sheer presence, but he had chosen not to. Instead, he watched. He allowed. He measured. And in that choice, he revealed something deeper about himself. Control did not need cruelty to exist. Breakfast, lunch, small tasks around the apartment, each became a subtle game of awareness. Janelle noticed how he would remain at the periphery, hands behind his back or folded neatly, watching the way she navigated even the simplest routine. There was no commentary, no instruction unless it was absolutely necessary. Yet every glance carried meaning. It was both comforting and unnerving. She never felt abandoned, but she also never felt entirely free. During one morning, as she washed dishes quietly, she felt his eyes on her. Not in scrutiny, but in silent observation. Her shoulders tensed automatically, and for a moment she bristled. Then, gradually, she recognized the nuance. He was not watching to punish. He was watching to understand, to learn, to anticipate, to ensure she could navigate her new reality safely. It was a lesson in power she had never anticipated. Real power, she realized, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it existed quietly, invisibly, in the act of restraint, in the careful distance maintained by someone capable of overriding you at any moment, in the choice to let someone exist within your sphere without interference. That evening, he approached her quietly while she was arranging papers in the living room, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinctive fear she could no longer deny. Yet he did not reach for her, did not intrude. He simply observed her, his gaze steady, measured. "You've adjusted more quickly than I expected," he said softly. Not praise, not mockery, just recognition. She didn't respond immediately. Words felt unnecessary, inadequate. Instead, she kept her movements deliberate, aware of the subtle shift in the air between them. He was closer now, yet not imposing. The space he allowed her was generous, yet controlled. "You're learning," he continued, and for the first time his tone held a faint warmth, not sentimentality, not indulgence, but acknowledgement. "You notice details others miss. You react appropriately under stress. You think before you act." The observation struck her as strange, almost invasive, and yet not unpleasant. It revealed a level of attention she had never encountered before, attention that did not demand, did not coerce, did not punish. It merely existed, and in its presence she felt the faintest trace of something unfamiliar, trust, cautious and unearned, but present nonetheless. Night fell again, and the city outside was a blur of lights and distant sound. He had allowed her the apartment, the view, the small routine she had carved for herself. And though she remained acutely aware of the boundaries, of the unspoken rules that governed her presence, she also recognized a pattern. He intervened only when necessary, corrected only when the line was crossed, and allowed her choices, even small ones, to exist unchallenged. It was an unexpected lesson in autonomy. In a world where her life had been reduced to a transaction, where every step had been dictated by fear, he allowed her a sliver of freedom. And that freedom, though small, was powerful. Janelle began to notice other subtleties. The way he adjusted the thermostat without a word, anticipating her comfort. The way he left her meals prepared but unobtrusive. The careful way he monitored the city from the balcony without ever intruding on her solitude. Each act was measured, precise, deliberate. And in that precision, she saw the edges of something else, a depth to him that was difficult to read, a complexity she could not yet grasp, but one that demanded recognition. By the time the night drew fully in, she understood something fundamental. He could have asserted dominance in countless ways, taken control through intimidation or wealth or reputation. Instead, he chose to watch, to observe, to permit. That choice was the first hint of the man behind the power. And the first step in her own understanding. That fear and respect could coexist, that power could exist without cruelty, and that survival sometimes meant learning to navigate subtlety rather than confrontation. And as she finally lay down to rest, Janelle realized that for the first time since the alley, she was not only surviving, she was beginning to understand the rules of this strange, precise world and the man who controlled it. A man who watched, not used, and in that quiet distinction, she found herself both unsettled and, unexpectedly, intrigued. The rhythm of the days had settled into a pattern quiet but exacting. Janelle's spark had begun to move with the rhythm, understanding the boundaries, anticipating the expectations, navigating the unspoken rules that defined her presence in Pete Rowland's controlled world. But even within that precision, small irregularities began to appear, subtle hints that beneath the composure there was something fragile, something human. It started with the way he paused at times when she didn't expect it, just long enough for a flicker of doubt to appear in his expression before he returned to his usual calm. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a sigh held just beneath audible sound, a hand that lingered on a surface slightly longer than necessary. Janelle noticed them all. She didn't comment, didn't ask questions. She merely observed, catalogued, and against her better judgment, allowed her curiosity to grow. He had always been precise, deliberate, as though every movement had been honed by decades of practice. But now, in the quiet moments, she saw a hesitation, a crack in the armor that had seemed impenetrable, a pause in his otherwise unyielding control. It wasn't weakness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, and it made her pulse quicken with a mixture of caution and intrigue. One afternoon, she found him standing by the balcony, looking out over the city in a way she had never seen before. The sharpness of his usual presence softened slightly, his shoulders slumping just a fraction, his hands resting on the railing with a tension she could almost feel. He didn't notice her approach, absorbed in whatever thoughts occupied his mind, yet the shift in his demeanor was undeniable. "You think about it too much," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. He didn't turn immediately, but when he did, she caught the faintest shadow of acknowledgement in his eyes. Not surprise, not irritation, but recognition that someone had noticed. For the first time, he did not hide behind the meticulous composure that had defined him since the alley. There was a flicker, a glimpse of the man beneath the carefully maintained exterior. The subtle cracks became more apparent in small interactions. He sometimes lingered in the kitchen while she prepared meals, observing not with instruction, but with a quiet intensity that suggested he was weighing, calculating, assessing. He would occasionally frown briefly at something trivial, a stain on the counter, a misplaced item, and then correct himself, as if annoyed not by the action but by the acknowledgement of his own attention to detail. Janelle realized that these moments were revealing more than she had anticipated. He was not infallible. His control was vast, but it was not perfect. And in those imperfections, she glimpsed a vulnerability he did not intend to share. It unsettled her. She had learned to navigate fear, to anticipate consequences, to measure her actions against the silent expectations of a man whose authority was absolute. But the cracks in his armor introduced uncertainty, not about him, but about what she could perceive, what she could understand, what she might be able to influence if she were careful. One evening, as they both worked in silence, the sound of a car backfiring on the street startled her. She flinched instinctively, and for a brief moment she caught him off guard as well. His hand twitched near the edge of the table, his jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, the calm precision she had come to rely on wavered. He quickly corrected himself, exhaling silently, his composure returning as if the interruption had never happened. But she had seen it. She had seen the imperfection, the subtle tremor in a man who rarely faltered. It was human, undeniable, and it sent a ripple of awareness through her. He was formidable, yes, but he was not untouchable. These moments accumulated, quietly, imperceptibly. She began to notice the way he sometimes lingered by the window after she had finished her tasks, or the way he would pause mid-action, lost in thought, before resuming with deliberate care. The armor of control was still there, but she could sense the underlying structure, the carefully maintained exterior that required constant effort to preserve. And in that recognition, something unexpected began to grow. Curiosity, certainly, but also a tentative understanding. The man who had seemed untouchable was not immune to observation, to nuance, to the subtle interplay of presence and awareness that defined their shared space. By the end of the week, Janelle had adjusted further to the routines, yet she carried with her the awareness that beneath the careful, controlled exterior of Pete Rowland, there were human vulnerabilities. She did not yet know what they meant or how to approach them, but the knowledge altered the dynamic. Fear had not disappeared, but it had evolved. Respect and awareness now intertwined with attention, and in that intricate balance, the faintest spark of connection began to emerge. The cracks in the armor were small, almost imperceptible, yet they were enough to shift the landscape. And for the first time since she had arrived, Janelle felt that she was not merely surviving in his world. She was beginning to see it, to understand it, and perhaps, in time, to navigate it on her own terms. The morning air carried the faint hum of the city below, a sound she had begun to notice even in moments of quiet contemplation. Janelle Sparks sat by the narrow window, hands clasped, her mind still tracing the events of the past days. She had adjusted to routines, to the rhythm of the apartment, to the measured presence of Pete Rowland. Yet, despite the calm, there was a persistent undercurrent, a tension she could not name, a quiet weight that accompanied every interaction. He approached silently, as he always did, but today there was something different. The usual control, the precise calm, remained, yet it carried a subtle note of deliberation, a faint edge that suggested intention beyond observation. He stood a few feet away, not demanding attention, not intruding but present. "I want to give you a choice," he said finally, the words deliberate and measured. He did not soften them, did not preface them with caution or reassurance. Just a statement, neutral in tone but heavy with implication. She froze. A choice. After days of carefully measured instructions, silent observation and subtle tests, a choice was a concept both unfamiliar and disorienting. Fear stirred immediately, followed closely by cautious curiosity. "Choice?" she echoed softly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the city. "Yes," he said, tilting his head slightly, eyes scanning her face, nodding every flicker of reaction. "The arrangements, the terms, the situation. It exists, yes, but within it there are parameters you can influence, actions you can take, decisions you can make that affect the course of this life you're stepping into. You can comply, or you can assert your own path within the boundaries provided." She struggled to digest the meaning. He could have dictated everything, reduced her life to obedience and routine, yet he chose not to. He offered her agency, subtle, constrained, but real. The realization unsettled her. Survival had always been about following rules, navigating fear, avoiding mistakes. Now there was something else, the responsibility to act deliberately within constraints. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice cautious. "Why give me that?" He considered her question without answering immediately. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, almost reflective. "Because you are not just a responsibility. You are not merely an obligation. You are a variable I cannot ignore. How you navigate this situation matters. Your decisions will affect outcomes in ways you may not yet understand. You must see that yourself." The words were unexpected. Respect, yes, but tempered with authority. A recognition of intelligence, awareness, and instinct. And for the first time she realized that her perception of him, formidable, controlled, deliberate, was incomplete. He had considered her not just a participant, but a factor, a presence capable of influencing the space they shared. The choice, however subtle, carried weight. She could comply fully, adhering to every guideline, every expectation, every rule with precision. Or she could assert herself. Cautiously testing the boundaries, exploring the limits of control, discovering where influence could shift, even if slightly. It was a challenge disguised as an opportunity. Janelle felt her pulse quicken. Fear was still present, but it had evolved. Awareness now mingled with tension, curiosity, and a tentative sense of possibility. She understood that any choice she made would be observed, measured, and noted. She would be accountable not just to circumstance, but to the man who had, until now, held absolute control. She began, hesitating, aware of the weight of the moment, the implications of even a single word. She realized sharply that this was more than a test of obedience. It was a test of instinct, perception, and courage. A moment that could define not just her daily life, but her sense of self within this controlled existence. "You don't need to answer immediately," he said, nodding the hesitation, the tension in her posture. "Consider it, observe, understand the boundaries, then act. Your choice will define the course from here. That is all." He stepped back, allowing space. Not retreating, not yielding, simply permitting the decision to exist within her grasp. The subtle power of restraint was evident, more formidable than any command or threat. And in that space, Janelle understood. The man who had seemed untouchable, impervious, and absolute had chosen to give her control in the smallest yet most significant way. She sat silently, letting the weight of the choice settle. Compliance was safe, predictable, understood. Assertion was uncertain, risky, fraught with potential consequences she could not yet anticipate. And yet within the tension, a spark of something unnameable emerged. Agency, possibility, a small but potent sense that her actions could matter. By the time he left the room, allowing her the solitude to consider, Janelle realized that the world had shifted subtly. Fear still lingered, but now it intertwined with awareness, with possibility. The choice he had offered was more than a decision. It was a test, a boundary, and an acknowledgement. She had survived the transaction, navigated the routines, and now, for the first time, she could act, not merely react. The moment was quiet, unremarkable to an outside observer, yet it was pivotal. Fear had met reality, reality had revealed control, and control had opened a door she had not expected, a door through which her own influence could begin to emerge. And for the first time since the alley, Janelle felt a faint but undeniable sense of power. Not over him, not yet, but over her own movements, decisions, and choices within the world he had constructed. The days had begun to blend into each other, measured and quiet, yet within that routine, a subtle tension began to grow, one neither Janelle Spark nor Pete Rowland could ignore. The initial fear that had dominated her arrival had not disappeared, but it had evolved, intertwined with something more complex. Awareness, curiosity, and the faint stirrings of attraction emerged in ways that neither dared to name aloud. It started in small moments. A glance held longer than necessary across the room. A gesture, almost imperceptible, that revealed care without intrusion. A shared silence where both understood more than words could convey. Janelle found herself noticing the faint lines around his eyes, the way his hands moved when he thought no one was watching, the subtle precision in his movements that had once felt intimidating but now held a strange fascination. She tried to resist the thoughts that crept into her mind, reminding herself that she had been sold into this arrangement, that control and power were constants, and that the boundaries were hers to respect. Yet, with each passing day, she felt herself caught in the subtle gravity of his presence. Pete, for his part, continued his quiet observation, allowing her space to exist within the rules, yet noticing every shift in expression, every hesitant movement, every unspoken question. He did not interfere, did not encourage, did not acknowledge directly the growing awareness between them. But in the precise way he managed his own presence, close enough to be felt, distant enough to preserve autonomy, he revealed a pattern that was both protective and magnetic. One evening, she found herself lingering near the balcony, staring at the city lights that stretched like distant constellations below. He appeared silently, leaning against the railing, his profile outlined against the dim glow. She sensed him before she saw him, as if the space between them was charged with a quiet, deliberate tension. "You've grown accustomed to the routines," he said, voice low, almost conversational, though not entirely relaxed. And yet, I notice you observe more than you follow." She turned slightly, aware of the subtle weight of his words. Observation had always been her strategy, her tool to navigate fear and uncertainty. But now, under his scrutiny, it felt different, exposed, personal, and uncomfortably intimate. "I notice what's around me," she said carefully, voice soft but steady. "I have to. I can't ignore it." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and looked away, his gaze returning to the cityscape. That single nod, minimal and controlled, carried acknowledgement and recognition, a subtle affirmation that she had passed another test of perception, patience, and adaptation. And then, in the quiet, something shifted. She realized that the tension between them had evolved beyond observation and compliance. It was no longer only about survival. It was about attention, about understanding, about the faint, undeniable awareness of each other's presence in ways that went beyond rules or expectations. Janelle felt her pulse quicken, not in fear, but in a reluctant recognition of the attraction that had begun to stir. It was unsettling, unexpected, and entirely unbidden. She had anticipated control, caution, and obedience, not the awareness that the man across from her, older, precise, commanding, could also be magnetic, compelling, and intriguing. Pete's control remained absolute, yet the subtle vulnerabilities she had begun to notice in previous days, the cracks in the armor, added a dimension to his presence that she could not ignore. A fleeting flicker of hesitation, a softened expression, a deliberate choice to allow her autonomy. These all hinted at the man beneath the formality and authority. And she could feel it, a pull that went beyond curiosity, beyond survival, to something more complicated and entirely forbidden. It was love without permission, unspoken and unacknowledged, yet undeniable in its presence. Neither had named it. Neither had admitted to it, and yet it existed in the measured glances, in the shared silences, in the quiet acknowledgement of each other's existence within the rules of this controlled, tense space. She understood sharply that any misstep could disrupt the fragile equilibrium. One word, one gesture, one movement too revealing could shift the dynamic entirely. Fear was still there, shadowing her thoughts, but it no longer dominated. Instead, it merged with awareness, tension, and the faint possibility that something real, something neither of them could have anticipated, was taking root. Pete remained as deliberate as ever, watching without interference, guiding without dominance. He did not name the tension, did not acknowledge the pull between them, but it was there, undeniable in the rhythm of shared space, the quiet moments that stretched and lingered, the subtle attention paid to the smallest of actions. As the city lights shimmered beneath them, Janelle realized she had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer just surviving, no longer just adapting. She was aware fully of the man beside her, of his presence, his influence, his subtle complexity. And in that awareness, she felt the first glimmers of connection that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with recognition, tension, and the unspoken possibility of more. The night was quiet, the air still, and in that stillness, Janelle Spark understood a truth she could not yet articulate. Love had begun without permission, uninvited and uncontrolled, yet profoundly present. And both of them, though unaware in words, had felt its weight in the silence. The quiet rhythm that Janelle had begun to navigate was shattered in small, deliberate waves. Messages arrived at unexpected hours, calls that went unanswered, people appearing in hallways or streets with the faint trace of authority or threat. The world outside the controlled environment Pete had constructed refused to stay distant. Her family's debts, the very reason she had been sold, had not disappeared. They lingered, pressing forward like shadows, reminders that she had entered a life defined not only by fear and restraint, but by expectation and obligation. Janelle felt the tension immediately. She had grown accustomed to the structure of the apartment, the subtle presence of Pete, the unspoken rules that governed her movements. But now the boundaries extended beyond walls and routines. Outside forces began to intrude, testing limits, threatening to unravel the fragile equilibrium that had taken days to establish. Pete noticed the change as quickly as she did. His movements became even more deliberate, his observation sharper. He did not rush to protect her in ways that were visible, but he adjusted the environment, the routines, the timing of interactions with outside parties. The calm precision that had defined him now took on a defensive edge. Every decision, every allowance, every subtle gesture was filtered through the lens of protection. One afternoon, a man arrived with a polite but insistent insistence that she be made available for a meeting regarding the debts. His tone was professional, almost cordial, but there was an unmistakable pressure in his words. Janelle felt a familiar flutter of fear, that acute awareness of vulnerability that had defined her life since the alley. Pete observed silently at first, his gaze assessing, calculating, weighing the potential risks. When he finally spoke, it was without anger or threat, just precise and unyielding. "She will not be moved," he said simply. The statement carried weight far beyond its simplicity. It was law, it was authority, it was an unspoken barrier no one dared challenge. The man hesitated, perhaps sensing the subtle danger in confronting him directly, and then retreated, leaving only the echo of his presence. Janelle exhaled slowly, acutely aware of the protection Pete had provided, yet also aware that the world was not finished with her. Each day, each message, each new figure that appeared reminded her that the arrangement was not a sanctuary. It was a delicate equilibrium, constantly threatened by forces beyond her control. In the evenings, the city lights stretched like a reminder of the distance between her past and the present. She and Pete maintained routines, careful movements, the silent rules of shared space. Yet the intrusion of external threats had shifted the energy between them. He remained calm, but the subtle vulnerability she had begun to perceive in him deepened. Even the man of unshakable control was affected by the world's pressure, and she realized that their connection, fraught, careful, measured, was influenced not just by proximity or observation, but by shared confrontation with forces beyond their control. Small moments reinforced the tension. A delayed message from her family, a warning of renewed pressure from creditors, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that she had been sold. Each of these moments intruded into the carefully maintained rhythm. Janelle's fear, her awareness, her careful observation of Pete, all sharpened in response. She noticed the faint tightening of his jaw, the subtle furrow of his brow, the way his eyes lingered longer than usual on entrances, hallways, the street below. Even he, the man who had seemed untouchable, responded to the world's encroachment. And in that response, she discovered something she had not anticipated: resilience. Not just hers, not just survival instinct honed by fear, but the quiet, calculated resilience of a man who could absorb the pressure of the outside world and maintain control without resorting to cruelty or panic. The cracks she had noticed in his armor were there, yes, but they were balanced by a strength that was precise, deliberate, and unyielding. In these days, a subtle shift began to occur in their dynamic. Fear remained, but it no longer dominated. Observation was constant, attention unrelenting, yet the tension now included an unspoken acknowledgement that both of them were navigating the pressures of the outside world, and that their connection, careful, measured, and constrained, was being tested by forces neither could fully control. By nightfall, after the latest intrusion had been neutralized, Janelle found herself on the balcony, watching the city shimmer with distance and threat. Pete stood beside her, not touching, not intruding, but present. The tension between them had deepened, not just attraction, not just curiosity, but mutual acknowledgement that the external world posed challenges neither could ignore. "You're aware," he said quietly, voice low and measured, "and you are adapting." She nodded, shoulders tense, pulse quickened not only by residual fear but by the subtle acknowledgement in his tone. Awareness, adaptation, resilience, they were no longer solitary traits. They existed within a shared space, defined by observation, subtle power, and an unspoken understanding of the pressures pressing against them. The world fought back, yes, but within the boundaries of controlled presence, measured observation, and deliberate interaction, Janelle and Pete were discovering something essential: that fear and pressure could be managed, that control could coexist with care, and that connection, unspoken, unacknowledged, fragile, could survive even under threat. The outside world would not relent. It would continue to intrude, to challenge, to test. But the man beside her, the one who had watched, observed, and restrained, had demonstrated something she could not ignore: the capacity to navigate danger with precision and to allow her to exist within that navigation. In that knowledge, Janelle realized that survival was no longer her only focus. Awareness, observation, and connection were equally critical, and as the night deepened, the city lights flickering below them, she understood a truth she could not yet speak. Together, they could endure what the world sent, even if the world fought back at every turn. The apartment had grown quiet, but the weight of everything that had passed lingered in the corners of the rooms. Days of observation, adjustment, and subtle tension had accumulated into a delicate equilibrium. Janelle Sparks sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on its surface, mind alert, heart still tuned to the faint pulses of the city beyond the windows. The outside pressures, the debts, the family expectations, the persistent intrusions, had not vanished. They remained, persistent shadows reminding her that her life had been shaped by necessity and compromise. Yet within the controlled space Pete Rowland maintained, a different reality had begun to take shape, one that was less about fear and more about understanding. Pete entered quietly, the familiar precision in his movements a grounding presence. He did not announce himself, did not demand acknowledgement. He simply appeared, the careful weight of his presence filling the room without crowding it. "Have you considered your options?" he asked, calm and measured, yet with the faintest trace of expectation hidden beneath the surface. Janelle met his gaze steadily, aware that the question was not casual. It was deliberate, a measure of her perception, her understanding, and the choices she had made in the quiet spaces of their shared world. "I have," she said finally, voice quiet but firm. "And I've realized I don't want to just follow rules anymore. I want to understand them, navigate them, and live within them on my own terms." He nodded once sharply, as though the simplicity of her statement carried weight far beyond its words. "Then we proceed differently," he said. "The boundaries remain, the obligations remain, but the way you exist within them will be yours. You are no longer simply a participant in a transaction. You are a factor, an agent, and a presence whose choices have meaning." The words settled heavily around her, but not oppressively. There was authority, yes, but also acknowledgement, recognition, a subtle shift in the balance of their relationship. She had survived the transaction, adapted to routines, observed the cracks in his armor, understood the pressures of the outside world, and now she was invited to exist within it actively, deliberately, and fully. It was a redefinition, not just of their arrangement, but of their dynamic. Fear no longer dominated her movements. Awareness and choice now intertwined with observation, tension, and the faint stirrings of something far more complex. Over the following days, the subtle changes unfolded. Janelle moved with greater confidence within the boundaries, anticipating his observations, understanding his patterns, and exercising discretion. Pete, in turn, allowed moments of independence, testing without interference, observing without imposition. The silent tension that had defined their relationship had shifted, softened by mutual understanding and cautious trust. Yet even as connection grew, so did awareness of the risks. The world beyond the apartment remained unpredictable, pressing, insistent. There were still messages, still intrusions. Still the faint hum of danger that reminded them both that the equilibrium they had carved was fragile. But within it, they discovered a shared rhythm, one defined by subtle authority, measured presence, and unspoken recognition of the other's influence. And then, one evening, as the city lights shimmered below, the truth became undeniable. In the quiet space of shared observation, in the careful acknowledgement of each other's boundaries, in the measured presence that defined their days, they had crossed a line neither had named but both understood. Janelle realized, with a mixture of fear and acceptance, that the man who had observed, restrained, and protected her was no longer just a figure of authority. He had become a presence that mattered, whose attention shaped her choices, whose influence guided her steps, whose acknowledgement carried weight beyond fear or obligation. Pete, in turn, understood that the girl he had been given as a solution to a problem had become something more, someone whose presence, awareness, and choices mattered, someone whose subtle understanding of him, his boundaries, and his vulnerabilities had reshaped the way he interacted, not just as a man of control, but as a man capable of connection, respect, and yes, something unspoken but undeniable. The deal had changed, not in its obligations, not in its boundaries, not in its practical terms, but in its meaning. It was no longer a transaction defined by fear or necessity. It was a space of negotiation, awareness, observation, and cautious connection, a space where survival, respect, and the faintest glimmer of mutual understanding could coexist. As the night deepened, Janelle and Pete stood side by side, neither touching, neither speaking, yet aware of the subtle charge between them. They had survived fear, navigated routines, observed and been observed, endured intrusion and pressure, and now existed within a redefined balance. A balance that acknowledged power and control, but also choice, observation, and quiet, unspoken connection. The deal had been redefined. The boundaries remained, but the rules of engagement had shifted. Fear and tension remained, yes, but tempered by understanding, mutual awareness, and the faint, undeniable possibility of something more. And in that stillness, the story that had begun with fear and necessity reached a new dimension, one of quiet respect, careful connection, and a world where the lives of a man and a woman, one older, commanding, and precise, the other young, aware, and resilient, could intersect, evolve, and endure, even as the world continued to fight back.